Great. Thanks, Carolyn. I appreciate you inviting me to talk. And if you don't mind, there are a few of you here whom I don't know, so could we do some quick introductions? You heard me, I'm Rachel Reneslacis. I'm in language and literature. My specialty is composition and TESOL, though, which is why I'm the person who ends up doing a lot of the assessment and the rubric development. Most of my colleagues are literature specialists. I'm a writing specialist, so that's my role. So would you mind?
Yeah, my name is Josh Taylor. I'm a part-time faculty in the business department, teaching organizational behavior right now.
Okay, thanks, Josh.
I'm Cody McFarland. I'm in the business department as well, and teaching project management and a couple of marketing classes. So I just put a rubric together for a project management end of course project last week. I used Dr. Thompson. I had a couple of templates that I used, but I'm interested in
and
what this is all about, how it applies to marketing, project management, and business.
It's been a few years ago now, but they did invite me to do a full day seminar with business department faculty a few years ago, where they really wanted to learn how to do writing assessment in their courses. So there probably are some good model rubrics still being handed around, and Dwayne would have had them. So I'm glad they're still keeping that focus.
I'm Joe Datham in the science department.
Okay.
I teach micro and AMP.
Okay, great. You guys should talk to, I guess.
I'm Pam Browning. I'm from the College of Ed.
I'm Steve Swindle, political science. But again, we're here for faculty council, senior review stuff, so that's motivation.
And as he's sitting down, I'll take the liberty to introduce my colleague, David Boersma. We just did brief introductions, David, that's okay. And he's a TESOL specialist, so teaching English to speakers of other languages. I'll confess that when I first started teaching a long time ago, and pretty far into my teaching career, I heard people talk about rubrics, and I thought, rubrics are silly. Because to me, all I really understood of it was that you put stuff in boxes. And I thought, I don't need stuff in boxes, I can grade papers. And that was sort of right, but as I got more advanced in my thinking and more advanced in my own scholarship and training, I came to understand that differently. And so the first thing I want to talk about is what a rubric is actually for. And one way that it helps you is it helps you communicate your expectations clearly to your students. So from the start, every time I give an assignment, I give the rubric at the same time, so that from the very beginning, students know exactly what I'm expecting and exactly how they'll be assessed. So if you have good rubrics, it goes a long way toward helping students just feel more confident with the assignment. So that's the first use of this tool. Second, it can save you a lot of time, because instead of having to write the same comments over and over, you might just mark sections on your rubric. You'll still write comments, you'll still engage individually, but as far as giving feedback to the student, having some kind of form that's well designed and that communicates well can save you a lot of time in commenting on the students' finished products. If you have large classes, or if you have multiple sections of a class, I found that a rubric is really helpful in helping you stay consistent. So sometimes I have 50 papers to read in a weekend. Those are not my best weekends. And no matter how good paper number 48 is, I'm irritated at it. Because this is just human. I trust that you all would feel similarly, unless you're far better people than I. But if I'm still using the rubric, and then I look at that, I check my responses against the rubric, say, okay, even though I'm tired, and even though this paper maybe sounds a lot like some of the other papers, still I have to judge it on these specific criteria that I laid out, and I can still do that pretty objectively, even on paper number 49. So not all of you might teach under that kind of circumstance, but if you do, I found that was a personal benefit for me. And then to me, the thing that has emerged as the most interesting aspect of the rubric is that it's actually a thinking exercise that helps you clarify what's the purpose of this assignment, what really counts as solid fulfillment of this assignment, sometimes even why are you assigning it. Sometimes people just assign a paper because they think all classes have to have papers. You say, write a 10-page paper on something related to this class, hand it in a month. There's not a clear sense of purpose sometimes in those assignments. But if you have to spell out for students what's going to make a good paper, then you have to think about, why is this assignment even in my course? How does it connect to course objectives? How does it connect to what went before or what comes next? So for me, this critical thinking for myself about my assignments has probably been the most valuable part of developing new rubrics. So basically the parts of a rubric, there's a description of the task, that would be the assignment. And you can use a rubric for just about any assignment. So my examples are for papers, because that's mostly what I teach. You can have a rubric for something as small as a classroom observation and a brief report. You can have math rubrics. You can have science rubrics, and some of you guys can help translate this into your own disciplines. So they don't have to be just for papers, but whatever it is, there's some assignment. That's the description. And then you'll have some kind of scale for scoring performance. And this could be letter grades. It could be just kind of descriptors, excellent, acceptable, needs work. Okay? There's no right or wrong. You choose what suits your style and what suits your particular class and your assignment. And when you have these box-shaped rubrics, usually the scale goes across the top, and this list of important components generally goes down the left. And so I like what's called an analytic rubric, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute, which defines some key traits and gives a score in each of those categories. I like that because to me that helps students see where they're strong and where they're relatively weaker. So they get a score that's a little bit broken down. I do have some sample rubrics later in the presentation that I'll show you, but I wanted to kind of do the setup first. So when you give the assignment, give the students the rubric at the same time. And in the assignment itself, try and spell out what are the key evaluation components. So I just gave a paper assignment to my freshmen today, and in the assignment it says, to succeed in this paper, the key thinking skill you'll need to demonstrate is synthesis. And then I talked some more about what synthesis means in this particular assignment, and I gave them some short examples. So from the start, they need to know what is it that you're going to care about most in the evaluation, and I put that both on the rubric and in the assignment, because for me the assignment has paragraphs, and so I can explain better what I'm looking for. This is just a teaching suggestion. It won't work in everybody's course calendar, but sometimes it's really useful to take a sample paper and work with your class and use the rubric and score that paper together, or that assignment, whatever it is, score that together, so that students then get a sense of how you're going to read the paper, how you're working with these categories, and they have to work with it themselves. So it gives you a kind of way to test if your rubric is clear and consistent. This doesn't have to take a lot of class time, and for some people you may not have class time to devote to it, so it's not required, but I find it can be useful, and perhaps could be some kind of an out-of-class assignment if you wanted students to try working with the rubric. Might be particularly important for a major project, that they've had some chance to work with the rubric and think about it. Developing the scale, it can be letter grades, it can be labels like these. The ones I listed in blue are just some examples. You can have your own, any kind of description that suits the way you've talked in your class. And just on a practicality level, 3 to 5 levels is the easiest size rubric to work with. You can have fewer and you can have more, but 3 to 5 is generally manageable. Sometimes depending on the project, especially if I'm doing group scoring, sometimes I intentionally write a 4-point rubric so that somebody can't just go straight down the middle all the way and say, yeah, this one's adequate, so that somebody has to make a choice better than average, lower than average. That's not appropriate in every single situation, but you think, what do you want from this grading? And if you do want to make choices, this is better than expected or below expected, then do an even number of categories rather than an odd number of categories. The dimensions, again, are the important aspects. So what matters? Thesis, if I were doing a paper, thesis, support, use of sources, organization, quality of argument, professionalism, which is what I call grammar and mechanics. Okay, those are the things I might have on my rubric. You could legitimately assign a paper that for your class had totally different dimensions. So you might not care about grammar. Okay, don't put it on there. You might not care about use of sources. Maybe it's not a source-based paper. Okay, so you don't have to use my descriptors, but you do have to be able to list maybe at least 4 or 5 things that are key to you in this assignment. And then you may choose to weight them. So maybe the thesis category is worth more than the proofreading category, for example. I don't do that just because it's real mathy. but at least half of you in the room, I think, could easily do that. Your choice. You do not have to, but sometimes weighting the rubric with point values helps students get a clearer sense of what's most important to you. So just know that that's always an option. I'm going to show you a couple samples that I have used. I made just a few copies. I wasn't sure how many people were going to be here, but maybe just kind of pass these around and share them amongst yourselves in case it's not easy for you to read on the screen. The first one I'm going to show you is an analytic rubric that I use for freshman research papers. So this is a very basic research paper. It is supposed to be source-based. And this is an example of what I meant when I said it's an analytic rubric. So down the side, my dimensions are quality of sources, support and development, documentation, thesis and organization, and professionalism. And I weight all those categories the same. So each of those is 20% of their overall grade. And then across the top, I tried to spell out what makes the difference between a B level use of sources and a C level use of sources. If you've ever tried to create a rubric from scratch, this is the hardest part. So I'm not gonna claim that this one's perfect. It's workable, but some of you sitting there right now might have a better idea of how to word this. Because sometimes it's really difficult to capture for students what's the difference between a variety of credible and relevant academic sources and a variety of credible, popular, and academic sources. Actually, I'm sort of happy with that one, I have to say. The inclusion of the word popular, to me, conveys what I'm trying to get at, that if you want an A, you're using peer-reviewed journals. If you want a B, you're using some journals, but maybe some other stuff that's less peer-reviewed. Okay? If you get a C, you've used something from like Wikipedia or Huffington Post or whatever site they're drawn to. And then if you get a D, your sources are pretty bad overall. So, but I had to think a while about how to convey what are these fine levels of distinction.
So I'm a points-oriented person, so I'd be one of those people. So if you're saying each category is a 20,
Yep.
I mean, could I look at that and say, well, quality of sources is 20 points, and then professionalism is also 20 points?
Yeah, yeah.
So then with each one of these, so this would be like a 20 out of 20.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So for some of you, it might make more sense to say, like here, this is a 20, this is a 15, this is a 10, and this is a 5.
You can also have a range, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, so like within the A, you could say 15 to 20. And then if they were super excellent, they get to 20. If they were pretty excellent, they get to 18. And then the next range of 10 to 14 or whatever. So yeah, you can set this up whatever way works with your method of thinking. I mean, clearly I'm a words person, okay? But numbers people can do exactly the same thing. The only thing that really makes a difference is that your students have to understand what you're telling them with the rubric. So whether it's got letters or numbers, they've got to be able to figure out what that means for their performance. When I deal with grammar and proofreading and stuff, I lump it all into one category called professionalism. And I try to explain the different levels here. This is one place where some professors do kind of go point by point, like they might take off a certain number of points for each grammar or proofreading error. Do that if that suits your style. In general, I prefer to talk about professionalism because I'm trying to convey to my students the sense that all these things that they call little errors matter in the way that they are perceived. But that's one place where I've seen a lot of people do tend to rely on numbers. I didn't bring you the assignment for that one, but I did. Next thing I'm going to give you is a rubric and an assignment that go together. And this is for a senior level analytical paper. It's from last time I taught our department's capstone class. So again, if you would just kind of spread those around, and I will put them on the screen in a minute. But I wanted you to see the assignment and the rubric that goes with it, so you could see how I've tried to make those two match up. I want to point out some of the key words here so you can see what I mean by connecting the assignment to the rubric. So in the second paragraph, we're clear, and these are senior level English majors, okay, so they're students who would be familiar with this language. There may be different terminology you'd use in your discipline, but these are advanced students. So I told them clearly write an analysis and response. So already they know what kind of genre this is supposed to be. Then I developed that a little bit with some thinking questions and directed them, go back to your initial reading responses. So they had a journal. I'm explicitly telling them they're going to have to go back and incorporate that journal. And then this third paragraph, your writing should be primarily analytical, not narrative, although there may certainly be some references. You're aiming for a synthesis of views on calling, bringing your thoughts together with thoughts from the reading. That's where I'm trying to help them clearly see the balance, because an essay about calling can easily turn into narrative, where students talk about how they feel called, or a time when they've lived out their calling. And I'm trying to signal to them with as many verbs as I can, include readings from the course, and include analysis. And then the due date is just the business of the course. Then in the rubric for that one, I tend to always lay out my rubrics similarly, so it looks a lot like the research paper one. But here, for an A, thesis expresses a clear stance on one aspect or calling of vocation, particularly as they are related to the student's work in English as a discipline. There I'm trying to get them to that focus thing. And then the synthesis category clearly spells out how they're supposed to be using the readings from the course. Down here, I created a category about accuracy and thoroughness of support, that I want to see that they've actually understood what we read, because these are advanced texts in most cases. And I want to see that the students have read those clearly and thoughtfully. If you're going to write your own rubric, the most fun category to write is the lowest scoring one. So I love this one. Writer relies on religious cliches, D. They're super easy to write, and especially if it's an assignment that you've done more than once, you know how they're likely to go wrong. So you can kind of warn your students through your rubric if you want to do that. Like, the easiest thing to do badly here is to just turn this into a rehash of stuff that you've heard before in Sunday school. And then I did not put a professionalism category on this one, because these are senior English majors. I'm assuming they can write decent sentences, and if they can't, we'll have a different kind of chat. I mean, that would be something apart from this assignment. So you see how that connection works, and maybe take, because some of you are in disciplines very different from mine, so take a minute and think, what would this look like the rubric that you just developed? How did it connect back to the assignment? And are students going to be able to see how these two pieces interlock with each other? Because that's the goal of making an assessment system that's effective and that's comprehensible to them.
Did you have a reason for not describing D for accuracy and thoroughness?
Oops, nope. Probably just forgot. Thanks, Pam.
And you also don't have F categories.
I don't know, because basically if you can't even
Much worse
manage,
than religious cliches.
yeah, if you can't manage to be unfocused and illogical, do I need to say F is you drew a picture? I don't know. So yeah, I've never seen a real reason for having F categories for papers. For example,
Truncated in again, just as philosophy of rubric is what I'm sure you're getting at. It's truncating the bottom end of the scale.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, and if you wanted an F category, you could easily add one. So there's nothing in the science of making rubrics that says you can't have one. Just in my own teaching approach, I tend not to include them, because I'm hoping it's obvious to students that if they don't manage to do at least this much stuff, religious cliches based on one source that is illogical, that probably doesn't even actually deserve a D. So I'm assuming that they can figure out that's where the F falls. If you were using a rubric for an exam or maybe something numberish, that's where an F category might be more useful, where you'd want to maybe be able to distinguish between a 40 and a 50. Even though they're both failing grades, there might be some reason why it would matter that a student knows what level of F they got or how far they were from passing. For a paper, that doesn't seem as relevant to me.
Can we go back to the numeric questions for A, B, C now? Again, if A is both a 98 and a 90, that's why rubrics are so I don't use them a lot.
Mhm.
Because for me, a 92 and a 98 are very, very different things. But if they're both A's, is the solution more categories,
it
or
could
is the
be.
solution multiple bullets underneath A, where maybe they did 2 of the 3, or
It would probably be better to put in more categories, because it's really hard to do assessment if there are too many things in this box. Like here, if I've got thesis expresses a clear stance on calling or vocation or the student's work in the English discipline. If I had something like that that allowed too many options, it can be really hard to choose.
but you also said 3 to 5 categories.
Yeah, but you can,
Again,
yeah.
this is all philosophy of rubric for me.
and you can make more, and I could even imagine something with subcategories. So if you don't like the A being like a whole 10 points, maybe you could have an A, and then under here, like sub boxes that say 97 to 100 does these things, 94 to 96 does these things, 91 to 93 does these things.
The same as multiple
So, yeah, exactly,
categories. Okay.
exactly. It would just be how you set it up in a way that was still visually interpretable for students.
Do you, in your ABCD version of things, do you think about high A's and low A's as you are grading?
What I tend to do, I default to assuming that each one of these is like 95, 85, 75, 65. But then when I do the final number, yeah, I'll adjust a little bit if I think they were particularly strong. Like I gave them a B, but I thought it was a strong B. I'd count that as like a B plus
put a check mark
in that.
next to
Exactly,
something.
exactly. So I adjust the points a little bit, but I start with the assumption that a straight B is an 85 for that dimension. Okay. Other questions or comments?
When
David,
you're
yeah.
working with the ABCD kind of
Mhm.
structure, how do you deal with if in one category they have, they have different grades for each category?
And they will. That's a feature of the analytic rubric, and it's a feature that I actually like. So, for example, maybe they get an A in thesis, and they get an A in synthesis, and maybe even an A in accuracy, but a C in independent thinking. So they had a strong thesis, they drew ideas together from the sources, they supported it, but everything that they said was pretty predictable. I can easily imagine that kind of paper. When they get the rubric back, I usually put check marks or circles in each category, and they'll still get a decent grade. They'd probably still end up with a B, but they can see, oh wait, my strengths were here, and my weakness is here. So to me, that's more useful feedback to them than if I just use a holistic rubric and just give them a straight A or B or C. And I'll show you a holistic rubric in a second if you want to see the difference. But it's just, the difference is simply the choice of which style of rubric you're
So
using.
within that though, I know you don't put them on there, but are you still assigning points so they see?
They do get a numerical
Okay.
a numerical grade because I have to enter something into Moodle, and that's
So if they got a C in independent thinking,
Mhm.
would that be like minus 20 points? So then they could see, because like to me, if I could see a student still being confused. Well, I had 3 A's and 1 C, so why can't I still have a low A?
yeah, and I'd have to do the math on that and
Okay. I'm just-
decide. But yeah, the way I do it is each category is equally weighted. So 3 A's and 1 C. I'd probably end up with about a B plus,
Okay.
although it would depend how good I thought the C was and how good I thought the A's were. So
14 divided by 4.
Yeah.
If you do grade point average, right? So 4.0, 4.0, 4.0,
Yep.
2.0.
Yep.
And then you just divide it by, then you get a 3.5 at that point.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
the math, right?
I think I'm going to trust you.
So what's a 3.5? Is that a B plus or an A minus?
Yeah.
So technically it's a B plus. 3.3 is a B plus and 3.7 is an A minus. So it's halfway between B plus and A minus, if
Yeah.
you were numbers.
Yes, exactly. And remember, I'm a language person. We're very comfortable with kind of fuzzy numbers. But I try not to be irresponsible about that. I've got a system. It's just, it doesn't break down to absolute, this paper is an 86 and this one is absolutely an 87. But you could design a system that did that. And for you as a teacher or your discipline, that might be a better fit than some of these. Let me back up and show you one holistic rubric. And I like this one. I made some copies of this too. I like this one because it's a rubric to grade class participation, which is not something I ever thought about writing a rubric for before, but it's actually perhaps kind of helpful. So if you wouldn't mind, can you spread those around as well? So a holistic rubric lists the levels. So your grade can be outstanding, very good, satisfactory, or not satisfactory. But then it has a whole bunch of different traits at each of those levels. And so the assumption is that to be graded outstanding, you'd have to demonstrate all or almost all of these traits. And if you do, then you get the outstanding. If you demonstrate this next set, you get the very good. This is a really kind of a useful kind of rubric for summative assessment. Like at the end of a course, when you're no longer really giving feedback that's going to help the students in their next projects, you're just kind of assessing everything they've done. That's where I think a holistic rubric can be useful. If you do any kind of portfolio assessment, a holistic rubric is pretty common there. Maybe some kind of smaller assignment where you just want to say good, okay, not so good. You could use a holistic rubric. For me, for my major projects, I prefer the analytic because I like that breakdown to say you were good at this and less good at this. And for my way of approaching it, the kind of rubric that I showed you before does that better. However, there are times when this one is the better choice. Just depends, are you trying to give feedback to help the student improve performance, or are you simply trying to assess and move on? Most large-scale writing assessment uses these holistic rubrics rather than analytic rubrics because they're not giving feedback. They're just giving a score that's used for placement or admission or something.
How do you integrate attendance into this, or do you at all? Like I've got students that are, when they are in class, they're outstanding, but they've only been there 3 times the entire semester.
I think what I would do in that case, if I were grading participation every day, or even if I was just grading it most days, if they're not there, they get a 0 that day. That doesn't even qualify. That's where we need, like Steve's thing about the F category. We need another category that says no participation, okay? And then they get a 0 for that day in participation grade. You might also have a separate attendance grade, and I'd give them a 0 in both, because if you don't show up, you don't get credit for talking or for being there. So you can handle that multiple ways according to whatever attendance policy you've set up. But I think a 0 category for participation is pretty defensible.
Yeah, the only rubric I actually ever use is I have a participation rubric for capstone.
Yeah.
And the only thing I've argued about is whether or not being there is the worst score you can get. You can actually be there and uncontribute to conversations, actually. I'd rather you not have been here today. So I'm not sure 0 is absent.
No, that's a good point. Do you have a category for uncontributed?
I actually decided to give 0 as absent, by the way, and I actually give them 1 point even if they're disruptive, because they physically got out of bed.
Okay.
But I argued with myself a long time about that, which is some days I don't want you here. Like, I would rather you not be here today, because you literally just moved us backwards in our dialogue.
Yeah. No, that's one reason why I included this rubric, that I know that grading class participation is tricky, and more speaking is not necessarily better participation.
Absolutely.
And I think this rubric attempts to address that. I put a reference down here. This is not one of mine. It's one that I found online, but I shared because I thought some other faculty might be interested in it. So is yours kind of like this? Is it holistic, basically?
It is holistic, and it's 6 points, I think, and I do it every day, and then you're not going to be productive about every conversation every day, so I tend to discount 15% of their participation grades in any given semester, because either they didn't have anything to say or whatever. That's not a fault of theirs. It was a boring reading in their opinions or whatever.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, and again, I only do it in capstone because such a huge part of their grade is participation, and I do it daily. It's the same thing. Because participation can just be an adjustment category at the end of the semester. If that, like, you don't want to give the person a B, so you say their participation was better or worse. Yeah. But I prefer the daily, and I give them updates every few weeks about that.
Yeah, and in a discussion class where participation is graded, I think it's important to have some kind of rubric for helping students know what counts as good participation. I have one class where I do that, but I don't have it in a rubric. It's just written out in their syllabus. and we look back at it as needed. But yeah, because it does create an area of possible unfairness, actually, if you don't really define what you mean by participation.
And I just put mine in my syllabus
Yeah.
as well. It's not handed out as an assignment or anything.
And then I think this is the last thing, almost the last thing. If you're going to develop some rubrics for yourself, first of all, there are like 1 billion of them online. So don't feel like you have to recreate the wheel. You can Google and you can find some examples. However, your rubrics are going to be better if you take those templates that you find online and you make them specific to your paper. Like the ones that I showed you from my class were based on specifically things we had done in that class. And they reflected my language and my way of speaking in class. So if you've never made rubrics before, there's no shame in looking for examples from your discipline. And you may find some that are great as is. I'd recommend that in most cases you do at least some adjustment so that it feels like this assessment instrument is organically a part of this assignment, and students can see how all of it works together in terms of the objectives of the class. But first, just wanted you to know that it's easy to find models to look at. And these are just some things I'd suggest for you as you're trying to write your own rubrics. First, why did you even create this assignment? Why did you think this was an important thing for students to do? And if you can list that, those will probably become some of your categories. Have you given this assignment before? And if you have, think back through it and think, what were the best ones and what were the worst ones and what went wrong? So writing rubrics gets easier the more times you've taught a class or the more times you've done an assignment, because you've got a greater breadth of knowledge in terms of predicting students' performance. How does this assignment relate to the rest of the course? Like in my example from Capstone, where I was asking them to draw from their previous readings, if that's part of it, that has to be clearly conveyed in the rubric. And then what skills will students need to have or develop to complete this assignment successfully? So do they need to know how to access the library databases, for example? Do they need to know how to use a certain piece of software? Do they need, I don't know from all your disciplines what might go in this category, but if there is some skill that they need, you've probably mentioned it in class, it's probably something you've covered, but you're going to be thinking about how do I build that into the rubric? Then clarifying what exactly is the assignment. I direct the Writing Center, and occasionally tutors will show me assignment sheets that they've gotten from faculty. And I don't want to rat out a colleague too much, but I saw one recently where I read the assignment sheet, and at the end of it, I still didn't know what the paper was supposed to be. I know sort of some words that were supposed to be in it, but I still didn't know if it was supposed to be like a personal essay or an analytical essay, and parts of it seemed like maybe it was a research essay. So the tutors were really stuck in knowing how to give advice. The students in that class were really stuck because the assignment didn't specifically tell them what genre of writing is this, what task is this, what are you supposed to be doing here. So you've got to be able to express that clearly. This is a different way of thinking about how you write your descriptors, but what evidence could students provide that would show they've accomplished what you wanted? And so for those of you who are not in disciplines that are as word interested as mine, you might think here, okay, in your discipline, what would count as demonstrating mastery? Maybe it's a project, maybe it's research of some sort, maybe it's creating spreadsheets. Could be lots and lots of different things, but for you, what do students need to have and demonstrate? And then thinking about what would an excellent example of this completed assignment look like, and what would the worst possible example look like? Clearly, the worst possible example is just not doing the assignment, with the exception of participation, as Steve pointed out. In every other case, the worst possible example is not doing it. So maybe think about what would be the worst example of somebody who actually does it, but does it as poorly as possible. I should probably refine that phrasing just a little bit. And to me, this is the part that's hardest, is writing these descriptors in a way that's really going to capture the distinctions between your levels and help students understand those levels. I gave you a reference down here. My presentation is drawn to some extent from this book, and I chose this one because it's applicable for people across disciplines. It's not just writing assessment, and you don't need to have a background in education assessment at all. Like some of you probably do, but if you don't, this book gives you a lot of hints about how to write and use rubrics across a variety of courses. So I listed it here. I'm sure Carolyn has it in the CTE library. I'm pretty sure you have the first edition. It's gone into a second edition since we started talking about rubrics, so it might be worth checking that, adding that to our shelves. But it's a good kind of entry-level book if you just want some practical advice and a lot of different kinds of models. Some of you are past entry level, so then it may not be as relevant. But that's the one that I chose as being a good representative for a variety of faculty. All right. I know why these two want to write a rubric. Can the rest of you tell me a little bit, what made you want to come and listen to this, and what kind of rubric-related questions do you have? Have we answered them?
I did at the end of, excuse me, at the end of the semester project.
Okay.
I kind of a group project, and I got some of my material from Dr. Smart, and he had shared some of his rubrics with me. And so I just wanted a little better understanding of where that comes from and how to use it properly.
Yeah, and a group project introduces a complication that we haven't yet talked about. A lot of times when I do group projects, I also have a rubric where group members rate each other's participation in the group. And so you might want to think about, do you want to include that? And if so, how do you want to ask them to rate each other? Because if you've assigned group projects very often at all, you know that they can go off the rails quickly. When they're great, and when they fall apart, they're terrible. So think about building that in as an additional rubric to your assessment for whatever you're going to do for the major grade.
Mine is very similar.
Okay.
I have group projects for each of my classes. But that's an interesting concept because I've been thinking about how do I give an individual grade within the project.
Yeah, and let me see, I think I can find one quickly. I teach professional and technical writing. Oh, here it is, team member. I actually, in that class, it's professional technical writing, so they do a lot of stuff that's in teams, and I actually had them work in teams to develop this rubric. And then throughout the semester, every time we did anything that was in groups, they used this rubric on each other. So I engaged them both in the thinking about how do you want to be evaluated, and then in evaluating each other. So when I'll teach the class again in the spring, the rubric will probably change because I'll have the students do the work again of thinking through what's a good evaluation for group membership. But they decided to do it this way. They laid out 10 behaviors of good group members, and then for each group member, in that category, they just gave a score, like a grade from 1 to 100. So if somebody was great and came to all the meetings, they got 100. If they submitted poor quality work, the student might decide to give them a 50. Okay? And then at the end, we added that up to make a group participation score for each student. So this is not my scoring. It doesn't have nearly the weight of my final grade, but it is a way that students can give you some feedback about how the group's functioning, and they can give each other some feedback. So I'm not lobbying strongly for this particular rubric, but something similar, I think, would be.
And have them rate themselves.
Yeah.
As well, because they have to be honest, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And you can actually take points off for them poorly evaluating their own contribution. So if their scores are very different than the other group of people.
Yeah. I think part of my initial resistance to using rubrics was that when you try to write with that level of precision, which I understand why you would want to do that, especially in some cases, it also started to feel really reductive to me. Like, well, did I count 3? Okay, I guess you have to get this point, even if the 3 were not that good or not that interesting. So it's the requirement for that level of precision is both a benefit and a drawback, I think. And so that's why I've landed on this kind of compromise that I use in classes. But yeah, if I were doing some kind of high stakes assessment somewhere else, yeah, I'd have to think about it differently. So I think that the thing to take away here is rubrics are infinitely flexible. And so think about, what do you want yours to do for you? And then what might be the best model to do that. If you can, test it with a few sample papers before you go live. Okay? Because you may find that you totally overlooked something. Like a student did something in a paper that you either wanted to reward or you wanted to take points away, but it's not on your rubric, so you can't really respond to it. So finding some way to test it, especially if it's the first time you've done an assignment, would be useful. Not always possible, but testing it is useful and revising it. So each time I do an assignment, before I put that one away completely for the semester, I think back through the rubric and think, did this give me the information I needed, or do I need to tweak something right now while I'm still thinking about it?
I'm trying to ask us something, again, our project is different, and
Yeah.
so I'm trying to think of a rubric that basically starts with everything you're supposed to do, and then just adds things to boxes. So these are sort of qualitatively different categories, as opposed to demonstrates 2, demonstrates 3, demonstrates 4. And are you familiar with any sort of rubric-y stuff that would distinguish those two types of models? And I realize that's a potentially narrow question.
Yeah.
So it's almost, you satisfy everything, and you need bonus points. I mean, it's
Yeah.
really an A and an A plus and an A plus plus.
Yeah, so what I'm thinking of is maybe there's just like a standard, almost like a holistic description of competency. Like to be okay, you have to have this stuff, okay? And then to be like okay plus 1, you have to have this stuff. Okay plus 2, you have to have this more stuff, and I don't know how many pluses there are.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you could imagine. I think you could develop something like that, and depicting it visually. I'm seeing like a big box. No, let's move
The
it.
box is getting bigger as you go up. Right?
Yeah. I'm thinking of almost like a bar graph. Like at the bottom is the big box of competency. Okay, you have to get in here. Okay, and then if you're in here, you might be able to climb some of these steps. And if you think of a bar graph, like each of the steps would have in it the specific things that a person would need to demonstrate or have accomplished.
Yeah.
I do not want to claim that rubrics will solve all of your teaching problems, but a few well-designed ones can solve many teaching problems. And I hope I've given you at least a starting point for today. Yes, Pam? Yeah.
The students are less likely to question.
To know that, yeah, thank you. That's another thing I meant to mention. That when I give them the rubric, somehow that makes them believe it's true. You know, and I mean, grading is always to some extent subjective. No matter what you're grading, there's always some subjective element in it. But when I can show them, okay, no, look, you had 3 refereed journal articles, but 3 articles from other sources, that puts you in the B category. You know, when I can say that, then it lessens their impulse to just think, oh, she just doesn't like me, or she didn't like my topic, or whatever. It externalizes the grading process in a way that can be really helpful.
Write that down on your paper. You had 3 academic sources and 3 not. Like, well, no, this is an academic source, but if you give them a rubric and it says that, it's like, oh, yeah, okay, I see it.
Yeah.
It's typed instead of perfect.
Yeah. So since I started using rubrics for almost every paper assignment, I don't think I've had a single student come and argue with me about a grade. They'll argue about other stuff, but it's really, really cut down the incidence of students arguing about paper grades, because it doesn't seem like I just made up a grade out of nowhere. No matter how much feedback I gave, there was always this sense of, well, I don't know what she's looking for. But now I've made an effort to tell them what I'm looking for.
Have you utilized self-assessment? So when I do peer reviews with our senior thesis thing, we put them in groups and they read each other's papers and whatever. And I found it useful for the person writing the paper to turn in their version of the rubric as they turn in the paper. And I'm wondering if you've ever done that.
Oh, you mean like they scored
They've actually
themselves?
scored themselves before they turn it in.
Yeah, we do a version of that in a lot of the advanced writing classes, because they're very workshop heavy. You know, there's a lot of peer review of the various kinds of writing. And so, yeah, we have them use a rubric, or if they don't do the rubric, they do a reflective paragraph or 2 that's tied to the rubric. You know,
I find it very useful for them to say, I know I'm a 2 on this right now.
Yeah.
It's something that I need to improve before the
Yeah.
final version.
Yeah.
And again, self-awareness is a level of knowledge that I wish more of our students attain.
Yeah, and I think advanced students might be more capable of it. But
Definitely, I would
yeah,
not have a freshman peer review
Yeah.
of their own work.
yeah. But if you are teaching advanced seminars in your major, I think that can be really helpful. And yeah, we do that a lot in some slightly different forms. Okay, that's all the rubric stuff I have to say. It's 5 minutes to 5. Let's call this a professionally accomplished day. So thanks for coming. And if you do have questions, I'd be happy to talk to you, because it's part of my job. So thank you.